Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, shipmates, compagneri. I hope you had a good visit in Napoli today. As you can see, that city is both has the ancient world and then recent turbulent history, and then a lot of construction, building the metro line right down to the harbor, and so it's sort of like the Roman Empire. It never was quite finished. And I was interested just walking around with a tour there to look at the youth who are, let's say, inheritors of this ancient city and all of its traditions and history. And they are dressed, I call, international teenage style of torn jeans and tattoos, and they're on their phones. And so there's a global culture that they're very much part of, however much aware of their past that they may be. But of course, the future is the challenge for all these countries, and particularly a new generation. That today we went down into the shelters below the palace and the Bourbon Temple and all of the bomb shelters that not too many decades ago people were huddled in, hiding from the terrible warfare that was around here. And now Italy in general is fairly prosperous, if still a rather disunified country, and it has a tumultuous politics, which you can read all about. But the future is always being reinvented with a different version by the next day of tomorrow. But today I'm going to talk about the sea itself and the future of the general region of the Mediterranean. And we are familiar with what it looks like from here, satellite view or reconstruction, that you have the north coast is the European side, Turkey to the east, the Levant, and all of the coast of North Africa. But what is striking is that Europe is still so green and lush, but North Africa is one of the driest and greatest deserts on Earth. And the future of the Mediterranean may be perhaps predicted in some of the past geology, because 15,000 years ago in the Ice Age, most of Europe was covered with ice, and Africa was still, the North Africa was not nearly as dry. And it's been said that even the drying out of North Africa was why humans got up and kept walking north, where it was cooler and there was not this climate change of a million years ago, perhaps. And then they ended up in Europe, whereas most of North Africa is very sparsely populated. Nonetheless, they share the sea. And this is a matter of some controversy and contention, but also some cooperation. So anyway, we know the countries fairly well, from Morocco to Turkey, Egypt to France, and all the different parts of this inland sea. I talked about the oceanography and the ecology of it, and it is divided into a number of basins, the Balearic in the west and the Tyrrhenian, where we are now, off of Italy and Sicily, then down the Ionian Sea, where we were, Corfu, and then we had come from, of course, the Aegean and Athens, and then there's the eastern Mediterranean, which has its own deep and abyssal plains. One thing that is of note in the eastern Mediterranean is they found a great deal of natural gas deposits, such that Israel and the other countries, Egypt and Turkey, may end up being net exporters of natural gas to the rest of Europe, which is going to be needing it. But meanwhile, the sea goes on as a living phenomena. This is just an illustration of some of the currents that swirl around counterclockwise, coming into Gibraltar, into the seas, and then have patterns all around here that nourishes the sea life, so that there's plenty of mineralization from the rivers coming in, upwellings of currents. So the Mediterranean is fairly rich in its biosphere, and until recently was just full of fish. Unfortunately, it's been impacted so that there's less and less catch every year, and it's a crisis of, let's say, overpopulation and overfishing. But back in the Miocene era, which is about 100 million years ago, the Mediterranean had been closed off from the Atlantic, and the continents were pulling apart and made these basins that filled up with fresh water, and then had land bridges to all of these other parts between Spain and Africa and Sicily and Tunisia, and filled in the Aegean. So that what we see now is the Mediterranean having been flooded by an opening with the Atlantic Ocean. But what this left was very large salt deposits on the bottom of the sea, of the Mediterranean, some of which has been uplifted by tectonic plates and can be seen now on many islands, Minorca, and even over in the coast of Croatia. And this is just an indication of how dramatic the Earth is in over geologic time, completely upending whole continents and seas. And so this may happen again with the Mediterranean. Now you have a level that is equal approximately with the Atlantic Ocean. There are irregularities in that depending on the temperature of the water, the salinity. But what you above all have all these leftover mountaintops that are the beautiful little islands of Capri where we are today and things. And also a variegated bottom life and sea life in all of its different areas. This is a appendage of the larger oceanic ecology. And we were here, I just wanted to show you where we were as of just yesterday at the Straits of Messina. And we came up around the boot of Italy, came past Messina, which is this ancient, actually Greek town, also Roman capital at one point of Sicily. But it has this beautiful sort of a fish hook of a harbor. And then I mentioned when I was talking from the bridge yesterday that there's this beautiful statue of the Madonna right at the entrance to the harbor. It was hard to see yesterday, so I thought I'd just show it to you. This is blessing the harbor and all of the many ships that go by this narrow straits. And it says, Vos et ipsan civitantem benedicium, which I believe means blessings to God and all of us who pass here. Well, the future may be maybe red in the rocks because all this formation of coasts and islands and peninsulas and bays is still changing with the tectonic plates that are still active. And particularly we're right near the Messina plate, which is the most active spot in all of the Mediterranean because there are fault lines, active volcanoes, some dormant, some active. We passed in the day Mount Etna, which was clouded in fog and steam. It has been erupting regularly for a number of years now, but very slowly. It's not endangering any larger population. But we also passed in the evening Stromboli, which is this volcano that sits right off of the coast of Sicily. We went right by it on our port side, but you could see in the twilight that it was steaming, but it had no fireworks for us as we had hoped. But look at what that little ship went by to take a closer look at it. Not advised because when it does go off, it starts throwing rocks and pumice lava out. And we've seen it puff and spew a couple of times. When it does get active every so many years, it draws climbers and tourists to come up and see it. So the future of the Mediterranean depends on where you are and what the geology is to a great degree. But let's say the humans are very fatalist, and sometimes they just like to be in a place which is beautiful. This is Santorini in Greece in the Aegean, which is in the island is the remains of a great crater that exploded in 1682 BC and left a tremendous cliff sides, and perhaps was the origin of the myth of Atlantis because it swept over and destroyed many of the Minoan cultural towns in Crete and in this area back that far back. But some people will still have a house or go there, even though that is still a dormant volcano, but even 3,000 years ago, that's fairly recent in geological time. So these sort of things do happen, and they may happen again, and people are ready for it. They're monitoring it, and they have evacuation plans and things like that. But nonetheless, there's a certain fatalism in Europe, and particularly in the Mediterranean, because of all of the past history of volcanic eruptions that wipe out places and earthquakes that swallow cities. So this is out of Dante's Inferno. We are familiar that the Straits of Gibraltar lets in Atlantic water to keep replenishing the Mediterranean. And previously the Mediterranean had been a freshwater lake, then it was drying out, then Hercules came and broke open the gate of Gibraltar. It was probably a great earthquake actually, but anyway, that meant that this entrance into the Mediterranean is still very dramatic. It's only 7 kilometers at the narrowest to cross over from Morocco to Spain. And so this has been the subject of some speculation of what will happen if the seas rise, and I'll come to that. But if it had been left as a land bridge, again, this is going back into the Miocene era, before it was broken up, there was a measurable land bridge, which is now called the sill, which is under the water right now. But they say that when it did break, either opened suddenly or it trickled open, there was perhaps one of the greatest waterfalls on Earth, filled up the Mediterranean within months or years. We just don't know because it's hard to read from the rocks. But if the seas do rise again, it may end up looking like this. This is just a projection, as if there's a certain amount of how many meter rise over the next 100 or 500 years. Gibraltar may just be an island, and there'll be all of this other reconfiguration of the Spanish and also North African coast. But in more immediate times, what we have is a European coastline, which has 18 different countries, a lot of industry, 100 million people within 50 kilometers of the shore, a lot of tourism. Millions of tourists come to all of the beaches, and so over the years they've been monitoring the load of pollution from even the North African oil production up the coast where all the industry is, and so this has had a dramatic effect on the fish life and on the water quality of the Mediterranean. And of course, most of it's concentrated in the north. Italy, in particular, Adriatic Sea has had a lot of pollution problems. It's gotten better just because of the regulations. We don't throw things overboard ships anymore. There are no more raw sewage allowed out into the sea. But just the overload of population is a great pressure upon the waters. And once it's in the water, it's hard to get it out. So there's a lot of let's say impact depending on where the locale, particularly the industry is. The other problem is it's been a ongoing desertification of the whole region. Even the south coast, meaning the African coast, once had much more lush vegetation than the north coast had deep forests until a millennia or so ago. And the main culprit was actually shipbuilding. All those wooden vessels would go further and get what trees they could, and it ended up denuding almost all of the islands and all of the near coasts. And this has led to, in recent times, bushfires. This is the Peloponnese in Greece a couple of years ago, but just in this last season there were major fires in Spain and France, and where there is anything to burn, it has been burning. Then the other problem is social, in that there is a constant wave of refugees that are trying to get into Europe. And this is due to the poverty and the environmental decline of many other countries. Drought in the Middle East, also in the Sahel and the southern Sahara area, means there are hundreds of millions of people who are, if they could, they would move to Europe and do anything to stay there just because they have nothing to eat and nothing to do down there. So this is the human crisis of the present and into the foreseeable future for Europe, because as long as they have smugglers who will take them in boats that will overload and go out and try to get them in, and they have rescue vessels, and some places have been helping them, and that means that only more come. So here's just scenes from different parts of the Mediterranean. This is Syrian refugees that came on a boat to a Greek island. And so this is the great crisis of the Mediterranean in social terms, because there are thousands of people dying every year trying to get on a flimsy boat and come over and do anything to stay here. And you see them in the streets of any Mediterranean port, all the different Africans and Middle Easterners who are selling whatever they can as a peddler. And the integration with the local society is, let's say, very difficult, because either they can't speak the language or they're just not welcome. The irony is that the population replacement rate of all these European nations is negative now that the people aren't having as many children, especially in Italy. And so they need people to work, and they could use refreshment of the population, but it's the cultural divides that are most difficult, particularly with the Islamic communities, who often do not want to assimilate or even be secular. Well, that's probably an intractable problem that just like in North America it is, and so it can only be managed, and that's, of course, a political debate that we're not going to get into right here. I'm going to talk more about what's going on in the actual sea. There are plans to change certain conditions that will be a general benefit. This is Istanbul with the Bosphorus, the route between the Aegean Sea through the Dardanelles to the Black Sea. This is an international strait by international maritime law, so it's open to all nations free of charge, though the Turkish government, by a treaty in the 1920s, said they will have the authority to stop any military vessels to go through, which they've been doing in the last year because of the war in Ukraine. But that transit of hundreds of ships a day, including big loaded tankers and things coming through the city, is a real hazard in traffic, and they've had a number of major incidents, and entire blocks of buildings have been knocked down by loose ship traffic. So the plan of the Turkish government is to build a new canal to the west of the Bosphorus, just outside the major city limits, but then it would be sort of like the Panama Canal of to the Black Sea. It does not require locks, though, so it would be a giant channel. This was done also in Greece at the Corinth Canal in 1881, which opened up ship traffic between the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea without going all the way around to Crete. Well, this has been debated again in Turkey, whether it's worth all the investment, and whether it'll actually improve the lives of the Turks is a real question. It's definitely better for navigational purposes. So that may be built within the next decade if there's the funding for it. The other kind of projects which are crucial to the future here are energy production. And so I mentioned natural gas and other immediate accessibility, but the greatest resource right in the area, this is a solar map, and you can see that North Africa has the greatest concentration of solar energy that comes down every day, and of course it's just burning up the sands not being used. So there's been a major project by the European Union and private energy companies to build vast scale solar farms. And so by estimate, if you see the red boxes there in the Sahara, all of the European Union could be powered by the middle-sized square. DE, that's actually Deutschland. That means the German market would just take a patch that big, and the whole world could be powered if there was an array as big as that square right there. Of course, the problem is transmission. You can, through the silicon solar panels and other newer kinds of capture technology, get a great deal of energy out of the sky and out of the sun, but to transmit it over to where it's used is the problem. So the cables and the dredging and all those sort of things that would be needed to take that amount of power from the Sahara up to Europe is the great expense. So they have been making a plan here. This is Desert Tech is a group of energy companies that have tried to make a comprehensive plan for the whole of Europe and North Africa, so that it would be a combination of the solar power, photovoltaics, which is a direct drive of DC current from solar panels, wind energy, hydro, biomass, and geothermal. When you add all of that up, there's plenty of energy to go around, but it's actually in the engineering and the practicality of getting it delivered at whatever price and whatever maybe the alternatives are. So this is pretty much impelled by, again, the large population, the energy inflation of everybody's using more and wanting more. And so whether Europe, and particularly with cooperation of the Middle East and North Africa, can do this is a real big question for the future. But the network is partly there. They begin to already have some generation in Morocco that goes to Spain, and some in Turkey that goes down to Egypt. And so parts of this, let's say, pan-national Mediterranean grid are already being built. But it could only get more so as they, let's say, provide more facilities and provide the transmission capabilities that would mean within maybe 50 years or a century, Europe and the Mediterranean could be petroleum-free. I don't know if the Saudi Arabians like that idea, but this is the future that is being impelled upon us. And so this whatever the political troubles of Europe and North Africa and the Middle East are, this is sort of the future cooperation, which is almost, again, necessary for the survival of our planet and our cultures here. But then there's bigger problems, which is the global climate change, which again is in the news because all the measurements that are coming back from particularly the polar regions, are indicating that our estimates are underestimates. And so in a general sense, it's considered that if the atmospheric pressure over the Arctic became lower on a seasonal prolonged basis, this would either warm or make colder many parts of the world. So you can see North America there, but in Europe means that it would get much warmer and drier, more forest fires, more hot summers and things like that. But Africa and other places would actually be cooler. But if it changes around and the cycles are reversed, which happens in global atmospheric conditions, if it's higher atmospheric pressure over the Arctic, Europe may suddenly be a frozen place more typical of its high latitude. You can see that the UK is comparable to northern Quebec, and Norway is like Greenland, except that it has the Gulf Stream also that warms it up. But in the Mediterranean, it's hard to know because you could have particularly a lot of stronger storms. And there, in the last few years, there have been sort of whiplash hurricanes that have been coming off the coast of West Africa, coming over Spain and into the Mediterranean. And that storm we had in Chioggia the other day and Ravenna, it may have been one of those, because it didn't feel to me like the typical winter north wind that just sort of barrels down off the mountains and suddenly gone. That was a pretty kicking storm, more typical of a tropical storm. And that may just be the way it is. Well, all of our seasonal expectations will be changed in the future. Well, we know that this is threatening many places, above all the canary in the climate mine, Venice. And it already has extensive flooding depending on the season and the tides. And so you saw that they were building the big barriers on the lagoon entrances, even in Chioggia, to try to keep the biggest of the surges out of the city and protect Venice. But then again, it may just turn the other way and be suddenly much colder and have more frigid weather than ever. So we just don't know what the result of all this will be. And what we try to do to prevent it may be like a trifle compared to the size of the problem. So this is the issue of our era. But if the seas do rise as they are measurably doing now, then within 100 years, Europe may be changed, and particularly the Mediterranean may be filled up even more. And this may be the coastlines within, I don't know if in our lifetime, but you can see, depending on how rocky or mountainous the coast are, certain places are bound to be flooded. The Marseille and the Riviera, Venice and the whole Po River Valley, and then the south coast of, rather the north coast of Africa has a lot of flats, so that may be all underwater. And then as you go east in the Mediterranean, the waters will make islands out of much of Egypt, fill up much of the landmass of in Greece, and then going up into even Odessa may be underwater, although I'm sure that Putin wouldn't mind. But this has led to a lot of people doing what they call ocean bioengineering to see how humans can actually live in the ocean. If the ocean's going to rise, well, we can either run uphill or we can meet it and provide lodging. This is a scientific station where these French divers and marine biologists lived in this pod under about 120 meters in the deep off of the French coast, just to see if they could survive. And of course they did, but it was not exactly comfortable. But there's been there's a lot of speculation about having to move out and live in the sea. So this is a current project where they have floating little cabins that are anchored down onto the bottom of the sea, but otherwise they're sort of bobbing above the waves, and they give you a little residence out there offshore. Some of these plans get very big, and they have whole plans for adding floating cities out in different parts of the world. But again, the cost versus the benefit, or whether it'll survive the storms or other things that would be coming along, is just unknown. but this is the speculation of the future. This has happened before, people trying to sort of do massive engineering to solve some human problems. This is a project that was proposed by a group of German engineers, particularly Heinrich Soren, who had what's called the anthropomorph project to make a dam at Gibraltar and then allow the evaporation to lower the level of the Mediterranean, opening up a great deal more land, they call it in German Lebensraum, for room to grow food, have new cities, things like this. And you can see particularly the Adriatic, which is very shallow, would become one giant valley, and then other parts of the Aegean and other parts of the North African coast would suddenly be there for the use of humanity. And so this was conceived of at a time when Germany was just about to go to war and sort of ruin the whole possibility of the future. But this Atlantropa, it's called, it would make detailed illustrations like you'd see of different places like the Dardanelles in Turkey, and then Sicily and the Nile Delta, that would make a great deal more land. But the proposal depended on the world's largest dam. And so this again was sketched out, not fully engineered, but to make a lock gate at Gibraltar like this, so that you would go through like the Panama Canal and be dropped down into the new low level of the Mediterranean. Now this was dismissed a long time ago because it just was so fantastically a large project, but it may actually be impelled again. The trade-off is whether the Mediterranean will flood out 100 cities and 100 million people, or shall they dam the Strait of Gibraltar and preserve the Mediterranean as we know it now. And this is, again, a sort of a futuristic plan that we can't possibly decide upon on ourselves. This is a larger decision of the European Union or the United Nations, or plus all the cooperation of everybody to agree to it. But it's maybe one of those decisions that's almost too big for humanity to make, particularly if we can't agree about even small things. Well, I had worked on a research vessel a number of years ago, which was originally funded by the filmmaker James Cameron, who was an amateur oceanographer when he wasn't fiddling around in films. And they built this concrete ferrocement ship that has sailed around the world 10 times doing marine biology research. And so they came to the Mediterranean on a sponsorship of the Museum of the Mediterranean in Marseille to do a sociological project to go around and record human history by oral tradition, by going to the smallest villages and the islands and going ashore and trying to find the oldest people they could find, and then interview them to get a record of their memory. And so that became an archive in Marseille to this day. But I have a film here of the ship which is sailing off of Marseille, and you might note it's not quite like Viking Star. It's more of a volunteer ragtag bunch of scientists and their friends, but I don't have an outlet on this. So therefore, I'm going to just narrate it to you that this is the ship, which is rigged as a Chinese junk. And it's, again, ferrocement. And this was the chief scientist and the director of the Institute of Ecotechnics, which is based in London and in New Mexico, and has ecological research programs around the world, including grassland research in Australia, olive research in southern France, different things. But it is pretty much a handmade and a hand-run ship with a volunteer crew. And this is off the coast of Marseille. That's the Ile d'Ypres, where the Count of Monte Cristo was imprisoned. And this does have an engine, but it is mainly a sail vessel. And then it has a laboratory on board and a scuba set, other boats. And we were taken into the old port of Marseille. When we were there, you can go there. It's a historic sort of square harbor that was originally founded by Phoenicians and then had Greeks and Romans there, and then it has its modern life now. But anyway, they would go around all these different islands to interview people, and this is very much a quiet ship, so you do gather a lot of sea life while you're underway. And so the different researchers come on board, and we did our program until the refugee crisis meant we couldn't get near the African coast lest we be swamped with refugees. And by maritime law, anybody who hails for help out at sea, if you go by and don't want to help them, then you are criminally liable for negligence if there's any death. Anyway, I was there talking about the ecological problems that are created by either climate change or deforestation or overpopulation that's driving the refugee crisis. But anyway, I think rather than explain it all, it's just the life of a ship that's very much hands-on. And of course, the curious thing about the ship, everybody has to do every other job, whether it's steering or navigating or cooking or such. And so it has its sort of life as a cruise ship. There may be 25 people maximum on it at a time. But I'm going to go on just to say that when you're out there in the middle of the ocean in a quiet sail ship, it's really a special place. It's just nothing is quite as quiet, nor is there anything as bright at night when the stars are out and there's no light pollution. And so by this means you get a kind of a palpable sense of the living sea. And if you're on a small vessel, you will find creatures come up to you, and you'll have let's say, a communion with the sea that you don't quite get on a large, beautiful ship like this. And so whatever the future of the Mediterranean is, it will still be alive, and I hope we'll all be there to enjoy it at the time. So I leave you with a couple of sayings here of the journey of the sea. I saw more than I remember, and remember more than I saw, which I hope is what happens with you. On our whirlwind trip around the Mediterranean, you're just getting a little taste of things. But then you can go back and read or come back and visit more and really appreciate them even more. And here's another saying: the time spent at sea does not add to your age. This is an old Phoenician saying that's been translated into Latin, Greek, and such. And so I repeat it here, saying that if you stay on this ship forever, you'll live forever, whether your family will miss you or not. And so here's one more for your contemplation, an ancient saying of Horace that "Celum non animam mutant qui transit mar current." Now we can all sing along like this. Those who run across the sea cannot change their soul, meaning you really shouldn't be in a hurry or too agitated, even if you're delayed or we didn't get into this port or that. You're here to have some pause and have some change of your environment and be out at sea, and then you can develop your own thoughts and your own future in mind. And this is a picture I just got yesterday because there was a group in Israel that had found a shipwreck off of Haifa that dated from some 400 BC, and it was in such good condition they measured and took its particulars, and then they built another one. And then they decided they're going to test the old navigation techniques and sail across the Mediterranean. Well, it took them 2 months to get from Haifa to Cyprus, which on a fast ferry now is about 6 hours. So there's where time has been remarkably compressed, and only when you come out at sea and take your time do you really get a sense of what the ocean is like and what this sea and all its history and myths mean, and thereby have an appreciation of the beautiful Mediterranean. And with that, I wish you a great voyage on board, and we'll see you in the future. Thank you very much.